Welcome everybody, and firstly, thank you. Thank you very much for staying on for this masterclass. What a number of us have been doing over the last 2 or 3 years is really following closely what's happening around this regime change to try to make your transition as easy as possible. My name is Mark Banicevich. As many of you know, I work for Partners Life. I'm blessed to work for a company that pays me to help you understand what to do now. Not a lot of companies would do that. And so I spend a lot of my time with the FSC doing this sort of work. I spend time talking to advisors. We've put together tools like our advisor support program to help you get your business ready for this regime. So there's a lot of work we're doing in this space. Over the next 2 hours, I'm again blessed to be working with some of the most incredible experts in our industry. And so I'm going to hand this over to smart people for most of this 2 hours and sit down and do nothing. Or, I don't know, something like that. But before we begin, it is very important that I thank our Masterclass sponsor. So although I work for Partners Life, I'm up here to thank Cigna for putting up some money to do this class. So thank you very much, Cigna. I can't see my slides. Are our slides going up? You can just imagine there's a Cigna logo on the screen, but we might get slapped by Cigna later if that happens. Where's our tech guys? Oh, there we go. Awesome, we're up. Now I can cue it. Awesome. There we are. Okay. So the team of people that are on the screen here that I want to thank, has everybody here come across the Financial Services Council Disclosure Guide? Raise your hand if you've seen this before. Okay, raise your hand if you've never seen this. We're going to be using this later on today, so you will get the opportunity to do this. And late last year, I got in touch with the legal members of the Financial Services Council and said, look, I've got this idea. I'd really like to put together a guide to help advisors that will make disclosure of this new regime really easy. And to the credit of our legal team, they all said, yeah, great, that's a great idea, let's get involved. So I had the distinct, simple job of splitting up the disclosure requirements into 6 parts and saying, can you write this bit, can you write this bit? So I'd like to say a really huge thank you to our legal experts, and we've got 3 of them at the moment and later 4 of them with us today. And over the course of the exercises we're going to do, all of us will be wandering around the table to answer questions. So I'd like to introduce, you'll see the names on the screen, but Jeremy Muir down the end. Jeremy's a partner at MinterEllisonRuddWatts. We've got Nick Summerfield, Nick's a partner at Anthony Harper, and Tracey Cross, who is a partner at DLA Piper. So some of the highest powered, smartest lawyers in the country sitting in this room. So if you need any legal help, get them to your table over the course of the next 2 hours. Okay? At the very least, they'll give you a business card. So a huge thank you to our legal advisors that have had a lot to do with this. And that's really why I wanted to involve them as much as we could in this exercise today, as a huge thank you for what they've done for us. I also want to draw your attention to the Professional Advice Hub that the Financial Services Council, we put this together probably 2 years ago, and we just filtered in new information as it became available to summarise what's going on with this change. So if you want a one-stop shop, what's going on, what is this law thing about? Hopefully you know the answer to that by now. What's this whole licensing thing? How much are fees? All that sort of stuff. There's one single place you can go to get a summary of the information and then direct you to other places to get more detail. Okay, so in fact, for those of you who have got laptops or phones, I'd like you to pull them out now and come to this page, and I'll tell you why. Later on in this masterclass, we're going to do a little exercise using this disclosure guide. So I'm now going to help you find it. So pull out your phone, turn on your laptop, go to advice.fsc.org.nz. When you get to that page, you scroll down a little bit and you see that list of 5 icons: FSLA, Code of Conduct, Disclosure, Licensing, Fees and Levies. Okay. If you're on your phone, it'll be vertical. If you're on your laptop, it'll be horizontal. Click on the disclosure link, and that will take you to a page that summarises the law around disclosure. You'll also see on that page the cover of this disclosure guide. Click on that cover, and that'll take you to a page that says, hey guys, we've written you this disclosure guide. And then down the bottom of that, or I think if you click on the image as well, there's something saying, read the guide. So open that guide up. Once you've got that guide open, raise your hand so I know you're with me. Oh, we've got a couple. Awesome, awesome. Someone got it open. Anyone over here? We want at least one person at every table to have this open, and keep that open because we're going to use it in about half an hour's time. Cool. Raise your hand if you're stuck. Raise your hand if you can't find the on button on your phone. Okay, we'll come around and help you during the presentation later on if you're getting stuck. Okay. Before we go any further, I want to do some quick polling. First up, raise your hand if you are a financial advisor. Okay, a lot of non-financial advisors down this end of the hall. Okay. Raise your hand if you're not sure whether you're a financial advisor. Okay, just checking. Okay, raise your hand if you're a financial advisor who is one of that 52% of financial advisors who has got a license for a sole advisor business. It's got a transitional license or getting a transitional license for your own business. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you're in a business, a financial advice provider with 2 to 5 advisors. Great. Raise your hand if you've got 5 to 20 advisors in your business. Okay, raise your hand if you're more than 20. Okay, cool. Give us an idea of where everyone's at. Raise your hand if you already have your level 5 certificate or you're an AFA. Okay. Raise your hand if you do not yet have the level 5 certificate or you're not an AFA. Raise it nice and high. We need to get a feel for this because this is going to become interactive later. Okay, so a lot of people in the room have already got what's required to meet that general competence, knowledge, and skill requirement, and a few of you have still got that to go. That's cool. I want you to think now on a scale of 0 to 10. 10 is, everything's sweet, I'm fine. 0 is, oh God. Where would you rate you and your business as how prepared you are for the 15th of March 2021? 22 business days. If you think that you and your business are pretty much on track, you may be a 7 or above, please raise your hand nice and high. Okay, you've already written your disclosure stuff, your website's all ready to go, everything's great. Okay, cool. Raise your hand if you think you're kind of a 4 to a 6 in readiness right now. Okay. Raise your hand if you're kind of a 1 to 3. Okay, that's why we're here to help, right? The industry is here to help you get ready. Cool. Today, we're going to go through 3 elements of what you'll need to do over the period of getting ready for 15th of March 2021 and also 15th of March 2023. Actually, I want to use that scale again. On a scale of 0 to 10, how prepared are you for the 15th of March 2023 or for full licensing? Who thinks they're 7 to 10 ready for full licensing? Who thinks they're 4 to 6 ready for full licensing? Who's thinking, oh God, full licensing? Okay, which is understandable. We haven't got too much from that yet, right? Has anybody read this document from the FMA? It's the introductory guide to full licensing. Anyone have trouble reading it? Wow, it's really complex to write a document like this, right? It's a challenge to put so much complex information into a small space. So it's a very difficult read. It will take time to understand. It would have been nice to put some headings through the document. Anyone from the FMA here that could actually add some headings and re-release it? That'd be bloody helpful, wouldn't it? Who's read the regulations? Who's read the disclosure regs? That's a high number. You know, if I were a financial advisor, I wouldn't think it's my job to read law. That's what lawyers are for. Just explain it to me, okay? And that's, as I say, a lot of what we want to do today. So, our agenda. If we can pop this up on screen, we've got 3 sections. We're going to do 3 mini workshops. The first one, I'm sure everyone in the room here knows David Greenslade of Strategi. He's a bit of a stalwart in the industry, really knows his stuff, and he's going to take us through competence and CPD and do a little bit of a workshop around things like your CPD plan. Who's an AFA in the room again? You're already used to writing your CPD plans. Who's a financial advisor who's not an AFA and already writes a CPD plan? Already does their planning every year. Okay, so that's going to become a discipline that we'll all have to do. So that's the first part of the workshop. The second part of the workshop is around disclosure, and we're very lucky here to have Steve Burgess of Compliance Refinery. Now, Steve and I worked together a long time ago at the FMA, and he's one of the people in the industry that really knows his stuff. So he's going to walk us through elements of that disclosure guide and get you using it. So it's going to be a very interactive workshop, which is why I recommend you don't sit at a table by yourself. The third part of the day is going to be with Karty, Maine of Rosewill Consulting, who many of you will know, and she's going to do a section on business continuity planning. So the first two parts of this workshop are relevant to every financial advisor in this room. The third part of the workshop is more focused towards financial advice providers, those of you that are directors of companies and things that are holding the license. So I hope you get a lot out of today. I just want to tell you a little bit about how the format's going to run for each of those three subsegments. We're going to have the facilitator, so whether it's David or Steve or Karty, talking about the session leading into the examples, and one of our legal experts we're really lucky to have is going to give us a little introduction to the law at part of that process. And there'll be a bunch of exercises that will happen over the course of that session. We're not going to be able to, in a room of 300 people, ask, does anyone have any questions? Let's get a mic out to you. So use Slido. Okay, use that Slido thing to fire your questions in, and even more importantly, during the exercises, we're going to be walking around the tables. Raise your hand, we'll have a conversation with you. Okay, so use this time as some free one-on-one consulting. I know these guys are probably thinking, free? I've got to give this stuff away for free, but yes, you do. Okay, so ask the questions, get us to your table. If we get any common questions, we'll share them at the end, but we're not going to have time for individual questions. Everyone comfortable with that? Great. Anyone not comfortable with that? Because if you're not, it's tough, I'm sorry. Okay, let's get started. So can I ask for a big thank you to our experts for coming along today? So please give them a big round of applause. And we'll clear the stage and leave it for Mr. Greenslade and Mr. Summerfield.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so let's get into it because time's pretty limited and we need to get through a whole heap of content. So very briefly, what we're going to do is just do a very, very quick recap on the basics around why do we have to be worried about competence, knowledge and skill, and then basically what is it. We're then going to do a little bit of a dive into what is this 2-year transitional period and this safe harbour that you often hear about, and how and when does it apply and who does it apply to. Then we're going to look at an area that people haven't often fully grasped, and that is understanding the difference between the current level 5 and the past level 5s and the new level 5, and how do you bridge the gaps, particularly the gaps around understanding the legislation, regulation, code, good conduct and all of those bits and pieces. Then we'll look at some of the pathways that are available, and then we'll sort of briefly stop, spend a few minutes, and we'll actually get you to, within your groups, identify where you sit on that pathway and what journey are you going on, and the training plan that you're putting in place for not only yourself, but all of the others who are going to be operating alongside you in your FAP. Then we're going to sort of talk around, for the bigger end of town, what do you do and how do you do it if you want to build the equivalent of the level 5 qualifications. And then we'll finish off with what is continuing professional development. Do we actually have to do that thing, especially when it's no longer specifically stated or mandated the number of hours? So is it still an issue that we need to be concerned with? Okay, so in order to look at and recap, we need to go back and look at what does the law say around this whole issue about competence, knowledge and skill. And for that, we'll just hand across to Nick, and Nick's going to just sort of run through the legal framework behind why we need to be concerned about all of this.
Hi everyone. I actually thought I was slide 4, so here we go, we'll get me out of the way. And as I say, I'm going to briefly recap on some of the legal requirements, basic requirements around competence, knowledge and skill. Do that quickly so we can get back to the more exciting stuff of talking about how you actually go about doing it in practice. 3 sections of the law up here on the slide. 431L is really the key one. So under that section, a person who gives regulated financial advice must exercise the care, diligence and skill that a prudent person engaged in their occupation would exercise in the same circumstances. So a similar duty applies under current law. The wording's slightly different, but it's effectively the same thing. So this isn't new. It's a duty that all advisors have at the moment. So it's something that should at least be reasonably familiar to everyone. The other benefit of this building on an existing requirement is that all the learnings we've had over the last 10 or so years around what this duty means and what you have to do to comply remain relevant. So this is an overarching duty, and it should guide you in everything that you do in this area, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Two other sections that are mentioned here is 431I and 431M, more or less serve to link the Act to the code. If you fail to comply with the code, you'll probably breach one of these sections, which leads to sanctions under the Act. Flip side is if you comply with the code and understand what's involved in that, then you are complying with these sections as well. Sitting underneath the Act is the code. In this case, we're talking about Code Standards 6 to 9. These set out general and particular competence requirements, as well as CPD, as David's already alluded to. And we are going to cover those in a bit more detail. One final point I want to make, though, before David comes back, is to talk about the safe harbour. You all know, I'm sure, that you have 2 years, or existing advisors have 2 years to meet the code's competence requirements, qualifications. If not, be glad you came, because it's great news for you. Safe harbour, though, is not a complete exemption from the need for competence. It doesn't give you free rein to give poor advice. That general overriding duty that I mentioned still applies, even if you've got an exemption from the particular standards of the code, and you need to be sure that you can meet it. So that means coming to something like this, understanding what your duties are, understanding what you need to do and being confident that you can do it, I should say. If you can't do that, then you can't give advice even without the safe harbour. So that's me with that pleasant thought.
Thanks very much for that, Nick.
Thanks.
Okay, so back on now, guys? Okay, so what we're now talking about is the actual code. So look at the code in total context, as opposed to looking at the code as being 9 separate standards. And what we've got up on the screen here is the contents page of the code. Now, the first thing to keep in the back of our minds is the code is split into 2 parts. Now, they are basically equal parts. So one sort of balances out the other. Where a lot of the emphasis and a lot of the discussion has been happening within the industry that we see is around standards 1 to 5. And people are focusing on putting in place policies, processes and controls to deal to that. Now, that's all fair and reasonable, and there's no issue around that. But if you spin it on its head, you've got to look at it and go, it's no use having policies, processes and controls if the people who are affected by those policies, processes and controls actually don't understand what they need to do. And that's part 2. So you could actually look at it in a slightly different way and go, if you knew all the things you need to know about the legislation, the regulation, the code, the conduct obligations, your product provider, new contract obligations, and so on and so forth, then if you inherently know that stuff inside and out, well then intrinsically you are going to deliver, hopefully, good advice. So therefore, investing into your competence, knowledge and skill is effectively investing into delivering good advice. So you can't have one without the other. So you need to have an equal approach and emphasis to part A or part 1 and part 2 of the code. They go hand in hand from that sort of perspective. So let's now go back and just have a few quick ticks looking at the transitional period. As Nick said, it's a safe harbour, but it's safe harbour relating to the advice that you were giving legally. I'll put it this way: if you were legally entitled to give advice on a particular type of product, let's say it's mortgages as an example, then you can transition into the new regime and you can continue to give advice on mortgages like you did before, but you still need to meet and understand the legislation, the regulation, the code, and the conduct. So you still have to comply with all of those overarching things. All it means is if you're doing mortgages on the 14th, you can continue to do mortgages on the 15th without actually having to prove you've got level 5 or the equivalent of that. However, if on the 14th you're only doing mortgages, and on the 15th, as a business or as an individual, you decided you're now wanting to give advice on investment, then you can't do that. The transition period doesn't apply for you because now you weren't doing that before the start date, so now you have to go and do the appropriate specialist strand of the New Zealand Certificate in Financial Services, Level 5, version 2. So any additional product advice that you're going to, or anticipating doing post the 15th that you weren't doing before the 15th of March, you need to start upskilling on that. And you've got to make sure that you were on the FSPR prior to the 15th. So this transition period only applies to those of us who are already practicing. If you have a new advisor that joins your business on or after the 15th, the transition period doesn't apply. They need to go and do their New Zealand Certificate in Financial Services Level 5 version 2 before they give advice, or prove that they've got an equivalent thereof to be able to start delivering advice. So I was quite pedantic because I spoke with the FMA just before we started around legally entitled to give advice. So what that means from the FMA's perspective is you need to be correctly notated and registered on the FSPR. If your FSPR doesn't give you the ability to give advice in certain areas, then just because you were practically doing that on the 14th, it doesn't mean to say you can start doing that on the 15th. So the hint here is go back, look at your FSPR and see what you're legally entitled to do. Because it may be not quite congruent from that sort of perspective. So let's then start looking at the area where we're seeing the biggest issue, and that is around understanding the legislation, regulation and code. And that's what we're talking here around closing the gaps. So there is a big difference, and just to demonstrate it, I've put up there on the screen one of the regulatory guides. We're on our 5th edition now, but that's sort of, I think, what, edition 4 or whatever. And that's totally out of date on the 15th. So everything you, or a lot of what you knew about the law today doesn't apply in the new regime. So there's a new regulatory handbook that covers all of the new things that you need to know as you move into the new regime. So the concept of saying, I'm an experienced advisor, I've been in this industry 30 years, so I know it all and I don't have to upskill, that's nonsense. Because none of us have done 30 years as a financial advisor in the new regime commencing on the 15th. All of us, myself included, as an AFA, we all have to go and do some form of upskilling. Now that can be informal or it can be formal. The type and where you go to do that training is entirely dependent upon your risk profile. If you are a high risk taker and you go, yeah, I can prove all of this, there's no issue at all, then just get hold of a regulatory guide or go and read all of the legislation. It doesn't really matter what you do, provided that when the FMA comes in and they do a review or your product provider asks for an external independent compliance review, you end up, everything is ticked and it's all nice and green and you're tickety-boo. That's the ultimate proof that you have the competence, knowledge and skill around the legislation, regulation and code. But if you're saying to the FMA, yeah, I know all of this, I don't have to do my CPD, don't have to worry about any of that closing of the gaps nonsense because I know it all, and then they start picking up a whole sea of red and a whole lot of issues, well then guess what? You need to go back and do some CPD. You need to do some upskilling because the proof is in the compliance review. That's the ultimate proof at the end of the day. And your product providers, no doubt, with the new contracts that you're signing and seeing, are starting to ask for proof that you will be, on an ongoing basis, compliant. So what are the pathways we need to look at? And this may be quite difficult to see on the screen with the light in here and things like that. But what we're basically saying is, if you've got no qualification today, the simplest, fastest, cheapest, easiest way to tick the boxes and prove competence, knowledge and skill is just to knuckle down and do your level 5, your New Zealand Certificate in Financial Services, level 5, version 2. That's the new one that's out there. If, however, you're like me and you're an AFA and I've done my old national certificate, or you've done the New Zealand Certificate version 1, then you've got a couple of options because we are sitting in the safe harbour area and we can transition into the new regime. All we've got to be able to do is demonstrate that difference around what was in the old qualification that you did and the new one. And so that's some form of closing the gaps. And there's a number of providers out there, and there's a number of opportunities for you to go through and do either informal or formal closing of the gaps. But if you can then get confirmation that you've covered off on that regulatory bit, then you know, you're pretty well defendable as you go through. Now, there's some of us out there who are the old and bold who are going, I've done all these hard yards with degrees and diplomas and everything else. I don't want to go and do level 5. I've heard dreadful things about it, and I'm not just going there. So there are alternative pathways for you. And there's a partnership that goes on with Skills, whereby you can come in and we can match up whatever your qualification is. It's a tedious, painful, expensive process, and we've got to look at whatever you had in the past, and we've got to match it to whatever the version 2 unit standards are. Identify that, and then develop a specialist course designed just for you to bridge those gaps. And then at the end of that, you've met the competency standards. That is expensive, it's painful. We've put through thousands and thousands of people through Strategi Institute. We've had a grand total of 2 people go through that recognition of prior learning, simply because it's so damn hard. But it's there. If you want to do it, there's no issue around that. Okay, so we'll stop for our first little workshop. It's not going to take us long. What I want you to do is in your tables, just have a look at it, and you may want to use this slide that's up there and go, where am I? What do I need to do? Am I totally confident I understand the legislation, regulation, code, and conduct obligations? If the answer is yes, then write on a piece of paper, yes, and this is how I know I'm confident. If the answer is no, then write on a piece of paper how you're going to fulfill that gap. And if you're thinking, okay, I need to get level 5, then how am I going to do that, and when am I going to do it? And the hint here is, don't leave it until 2023, just before the transition period expires. We want to do it sooner rather than later. So just take about 2 or 3 minutes, work it out, have a quick discussion, and then we'll get back into it again. So hopefully as an output for all of you as individuals, what you've done is you've identified, do I need to do some form of closing the gaps? And what is that form of closing the gaps meant to be? And perhaps another thing you may want to throw in is, when should I do it? Is it a good idea to do it before the 15th of March or sometime in the future? And a hint here is, it's often a good idea to understand the law before we're into the new regime, but that's a personal preference really, and time will tell as to how you interact with the FMA around that little issue. And the other thing you want to be able to have established is, do I need to do the level 5, or am I actually going to build an equivalent of level 5 if I'm at the bigger end of town? And then the answer there is, if you are going to build a bigger one, then what do we do and how do we do that? And that's what the next slide is all about. And so hopefully that's given you a quick summary. And then the other thing you've got to look at is, if you are representing one of many in your business here, what's the impact on all the other advisors in your business? Have you got some form of spreadsheet where you've got every single advisor, what qualifications they have today, you've given them some form of risk rating, and you've identified what the knowledge gaps are, and you have a plan for each of your advisors as to what and when they need to do that upskilling to improve competence, knowledge, and skill. Okay. The code says the gold standard is the New Zealand Certificate Financial Services Level 5 version 2, but it also says you can have the equivalent of that. Now, equivalency is built up through not just you having some other qualification, it's built up through the systems and processes and controls that your business wraps around you as an advisor. So the equivalence is a mixture of you as the human and your FAP as the entity. Combined, it's providing the equivalent. Now, it's not giving you the level 5 qualification. If you get a sign-off on the equivalency from the likes of ourselves or whatever who can do that, then the thing you've got to look at is it's only equivalent for the role that the individual is doing today. If they change roles within your business or they move from one company to another, that equivalency doesn't go with them because it's a role equivalency as opposed to an individual. The safest way is to have the actual qualification because the qualification is attached to you, the individual or the human. So to build the equivalency, and it's typically, and we're doing a lot of this work at the moment at the bigger end of town, or where we've got businesses that are product providers with whole heaps of call centre staff and very simple, single one or two products that they're offering, then building an equivalent is really good. The staff there don't have to go and do the entire level 5, but the narrow range of scope that they're doing has to tick all the boxes around the 6-step advice process and all the other bits and pieces, and the advisors need training to be able to prove that they're operating compliantly at that level 5 equivalent. It's perfectly feasible to do, but for the majority of us in this room, it's just not financially viable to do. But if you want to do it, happy to help. So next thing to have a look at is our CPD. So CPD is covered under Code Standard 9, so it's right at the back. Now that doesn't signal it's the least important standard. It's far from it. You could almost argue it's one of the most important standards there. And now it's not prescriptive. And so this is where the issue lies because it's a principles-based document. And they're saying in here that you need to do sufficient CPD, continuing professional development, to meet whatever the type of advice you're doing. So the simple approach you would take with CPD is to look at your business and your business plan, and you'd go, what are we doing today? What do we want to do over the next 1 to 2 years? And you work out what that difference is. You then look at it and you go, what type of advisors, what type of competence, what sort of skill sets do we have today? What about our target market? Is it likely to change over the next couple of years? Are they more vulnerable, less vulnerable? Can they understand things better or worse? Do you have a target market where English perhaps isn't their first language? All of these things come into it together with any changes in consumer legislation or consumer sort of trends, and also changes in legislation and regulator guidance. Because under the new level 5, version 2, the unit standards say you've got to be current with all applicable legislation, regulation, code, and guidance from the regulator issued from time to time. So if the FMA issues new guidance, even though guidance notes or information sheets aren't legally binding, there's an expectation that you, if you're a professional and operating at the equivalent of version 2, level 5, would know about those guidance notes. And you will have studied them, looked at the implications and decided, I'm going to ignore that, or gosh, there's parts of that I'm going to implement into my business. So that needs to be an ongoing thing. So you need to be able to do that sort of gap analysis. The other thing the Standard 9 talks about is on an annual basis, the entity, which is the FAP, or if you've got an authorised body, it'll be the authorised body as well as the individual, which is you and I, the humans, are expected to annually analyse and review our current level of professionalism, do our gap analysis, and then plan our training, and then monitor and log that training. So in other words, it's the same as what an AFA does today. You would end up having a professional development plan, and that was where you will record all the types of training you're going to do, when and who with, and what's it going to cover, and what's the aims, outcomes, and objectives, and all that sort of good gear stuff. And then you'll have a CPD log. So when you're thinking about CPD, although it's not prescriptive as to the number of hours, so you're not going to see anyone saying you've got to do 30 CPD hours over 2 CPD periods like we have today, we've got to appreciate is the whole intent of this legislation and regulation and code is to bring the industry up equivalent to or slightly above that of an AFA today. So if they are the obligations that an AFA is expected to do today, then expect that if you're an RFA or a nominated rep, you need to come up to a similar, if not higher standard. So for most of us, there's a bucket load of continuing professional development we need to be doing over the next 12 months. And before we break for a quick little exercise where you're going to just sort of try and jot down what your gap analysis is in your business and what sort of training perhaps you might want to do, think about it holistically. And by that, I mean whole of business, whole of client. It's not just around understanding the law or understanding the products. They are important, but it's also understanding phenology, which is the psychology of sort of decisions and finance and things like that. It's understanding consumer trends. It's understanding your individual preferences and idiosyncrasies around how you actually give advice. It's understanding how I use technology in order to better deliver a better outcome and suitability outcome for our clients. So it's looking at every single aspect. So don't build a CPD plan just based on one or two segments or one or two areas. So let's take another sort of 2 or 3 minutes and quickly within your groups or individually start to build out your professional development plan, and then we'll get back together, wrap it up, and then we're on to back to Mark. So take about 3 minutes. So hopefully you've started to look at your professional development plan and you've said, oh, I might have a couple of gaps here. So although I've been in the business for 30 odd years, there perhaps is something that I may need to do this year in particular, sooner rather than later. And certainly over the next 2 years, we've got a whole lot of things we've got to do as well. So myself as a practicing AFA, I've got my AFA, I've got my Massey diploma, I've got my level 5. But even for people like me, I need to go back and I need to do closing of the gaps and I need to keep upskilling, because that's what a professional does. It never stops. This is a relentless pursuit of excellence that we need to be doing as professionals in our industry to meet and exceed the expectations of our clients. The days of sitting there collecting commissions or collecting fees and not adding a whole heap of value is going to disappear or slowly sort of vaporize over time. You only have to look at Australia and where Australia has gone as far as educational qualifications to realise that we're staring down the barrel. And if all of us as industry participants lift our game and deliver high quality, highly suitable compliant advice, the FMA and the Code Committee are going to go, we've done our job, and they won't fiddle with us for quite a while. They'll let us continue on, provided the client base out there is happy. So what happens next as far as future education? It's in our hands right now. So if we do a good job, that's collectively as an industry, meet client expectations, then we're tickety-boo. If we don't, we need to expect something else to come down the track. So just wrapping it up, what the gold standard is the New Zealand Certificate in Financial Services Level 5 version 2. You don't physically have to have that if you've already been operating in the regime that we have today and you already have AFA status, New Zealand Certificate, National Certificate version 1. But you do need to be able to prove that you understand legislation, regulation, code, guidance notes, and all those other good gear things. Hopefully, with what Nick has talked about and myself, you've got some degree of confidence and understanding around the transitional period, in that it's not the open slather that some people have been saying it is. There's actually things that you and I need to do as a professional to meet our legal obligations. And then what we're talking about is find some solutions sooner rather than later so that you can close the gaps between the old qualifications and the new. Now, a word of advice here. If you are an existing advisor who's transitioning into the regime and you have no intention of continuing in this industry at the end of the transition period, then you still have an obligation to be compliant. You still have an obligation to understand the legislation. So you may be able to sort of hobble your way through the next 2 years, but at least do closing the gaps sooner rather than later so you understand the regulatory environment and the risks you're taking on. And then if you have any details, just talk to Daniel and Greg and the team, and they'll sort you out. So I'll hand you back to Mark, and we'll look at something far more exciting, which is disclosure.
Thank you, David.
There you go, Tracey.
Thank you very much, David. David's going to be here, of course, for the next part of the workshops as well. So if you want to grab him, he's here. Make the most of him while he's here and ask those questions. One of the key things for me that come out of that part, one is getting your level 5 and stuff. Of course, we've known that for a while. You just got to go out and get it done or have an equivalency of some sort. Where there's a little bit of a hook is particularly for those of you that are among that 52% that are sole advisor businesses or those small businesses, although you've got 2 years to get that level 5, for those of you who don't, on the 15th of March, your business, all the advice that leaves your business has to meet the legal requirements on the 15th of March this year. So you still have to know the detail and stuff, the ins and outs of that level 5 certificate. Someone in the business has to know some way of knowing that your business meets those legal requirements. Has to be done on the 15th of March this year. So if you've got 20 advisors in your business and 2 of them don't have their certificate yet, that's not a problem. You can kind of cover it off. But as a sole advisor business, you've still got to get your head around everything in the next 22 working days. The other thing that really stands out for me is this process of CPD that David was talking about at the end of the year. We're going to get to a mindset where a lot of AFAs already are, where start of the year, you pull out a blank sheet of paper, you do the work that you've just done. Where are my gaps? Where do I need to improve? You then go out and hunt for places to learn that stuff. In my place, area and personal risk, there are a lot of advisors that just kind of stumble along and do whatever training is offered by the providers. That's not going to cut it anymore. You've actually got to identify where your weaknesses are, go and hunt for places to give you that learning, whether it be Strategi, whether it be Governance New Zealand, wherever it may be, or maybe in some cases the providers. You're also going to need to, of course, maintain a register of all the learning you've done. Keep a record of everything you've done. And in this world where we're moving really away from the structured, unstructured thing, some form of evidence that you've done the training, and then somebody in the firm, which can be you, will need to go back and check it every few months, check that register, and make sure it's up to date. And then check at the end of the year, this is what I planned to do, did I do it? Okay, that's part of the compliance of making sure that you keep keeping up with those obligations. So they're really, for me, the key takeaways. We're going to move on now to disclosure. I've took you through before advice.fsc.org.nz to get to the FSC disclosure guide. Make sure you've got that up in front of you now, whether it's a printout on your phone, on your computer, because we're going to get into that now. And it is my pleasure to introduce again Steve Burgess from Compliance Refinery, a good friend, good man, and one of the people in the industry that really knows his stuff, as all the people we have representing today do. And again, of course, Tracey Cross from DLA Piper, another one of our great legal experts, and I'll hand over to them for the next 30 minutes. So thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, David and Nick, for that great sort of session. I'm going to very briefly introduce the disclosure. I'm not going to take you through all the legals because Steve has very competently got the detail on the slides, so you don't need both of us going over them. I think it's more important to get into the practicalities when we sort of go through some of the scenarios. I would like to make a couple of high-level comments. If we think about the purpose of the regime, it's about access to advice, quality advice, and we want trusted advice, which is all about the relationship with the client. Disclosure is a really important platform of this new regime, and while we've already had existing disclosure under the FAA, it does change. We still have key information that needs to be disclosed, but it changes with a 4-tier disclosure process, which Steve will talk about. It also changes because we have a lot more flexibility under this new regime, and as Angus referred to earlier, I think we need to be bold in how we use that flexibility. We've just heard Baz sort of talking about how we record the podcast and what have you. I mean, crikey, be bold. We could be doing disclosure like that. I mean, for those that really wanted to sort of lead. I just ask you to, when you're thinking about disclosure, we need to elevate the conversation past tick-the-box compliance. We should be thinking about, how do you want to engage with your clients? How do you want your disclosure? What do you want to look like? What's going to work for your client? I mean, for me, that's what we need to be thinking about. That's where we're going to make the difference in moving from this very prescriptive, what we must disclose, how we must disclose it. We know that that doesn't work for our clients. They haven't read it. Really looking to how we're going to change it up. So please, when you're going through this, you've got the Great FSC resource. We're going to look at some scenarios. Really sort of keep that in mind. And, even if you've prepared your disclosure statements, just dust them off a bit and have a think about, is this really going to work from a client's perspective? Because I think that's a really important aspect of it. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Steve.
Thanks, Tracey. That's fantastic. I will just introduce you to what we're going to speak about today. We're going to do a brief overview of the changes, probably for about 5 to 7 minutes. We'll talk about the disclosure guide for a few minutes, and then we're going to have 2 workshops. The first workshop will be to go through the nature and scope part of the publicly available information, and then the conflicts and interest in the scope portion of disclosure. Tracey made some great points about flexibility, and that's a big part of the change in this regime. So you'll have heard a key date today, which is very important that you all keep in mind. It's the 15th of March 2021, and that's the date you have to make those changes by. So as you prioritize your workload in the next month, how many of you have actually started to update your disclosure at this stage? That's a really good number. How many of you have finished? That's a lot less and more realistic. So I'd say that as you're going forward, the 15th of March 21 is a very important date, and ideally you'll have this done by the beginning of March, and you won't have any stress moving forward. This session's intended to just move you in that direction. So one of the key changes is no more primary secondary disclosure. We're looking at an entirely different format of disclosure. And as Tracey said, one of the key terms here is flexibility. And one of the things, you can be bold and keep the client in mind. How does the client understand disclosure? How do they get it in? And how does you disclosing impact the advice you're giving and their ability to interact with that advice? Really key things for you to remember. So what we're moving towards is publicly available disclosure when the nature and scope of the advice is known, and when advice is given. And then at the end, the 4th stage is when a complaint is received. And hopefully you won't be getting very many of those. So in terms of the new flexible approach to disclosing, so you can have it in writing or verbal, however you like. As Tracey was saying, it is a good opportunity for you to be a bit bold, and bigger businesses and smaller businesses are going to be able to interact with it differently. You're going to be able to do it in different formats at different stages, which is really important because we're leaving that regime where you're just going to have documents, separate documents, you give to somebody and they don't read, or that you attach to an email and they never get opened. The intention of this is to really leave it up to you to come up with creative ways to actually interact with your clients and provide value to them in this process. I think the previous regime, it was generally accepted that the vast majority of clients rarely interacted with or ever read disclosure. I'm sure there's some of you in the room that would say literally 0 of your clients ever read your disclosure statements. And another great part of this is it can integrate into the advice process. And this is where a lot of you are having digital tools that are coming in to play. So these are really key things to think about. How does it interact with your advice process? And you can have it participate in different stages. I did want to cover off a couple of things. As you're giving your disclosure, you need to think about certain things. If you're going to do something verbal, how is that going to incorporate into your record-keeping policy? So these are the types of things you have to think about. Make sure that as you're doing your disclosure, you're strongly considering your record-keeping policy. How does your privacy statement, and how does that incorporate into your privacy statement? Very important for your business. And your advice process, a lot of you will have a client acknowledgement in there somewhere that potentially covers your privacy. How are you going to address that in terms of disclosure? Really important things to consider. And as with what David spoke about, as with what Karty spoke about, you need to think about it from a business perspective. You can't just isolate it and say, oh, this is disclosure. A lot of you now will have different policies and procedures, and then you're going to have to incorporate those into that. And it's just not as simple as just having a document that you give out and somebody signs something along the way. So that's going to be what we consider a relatively exciting new adventure for you guys and a new way to interact and add value to clients. So one of the big questions we have here is what commissions and incentives should be disclosed. And there's a couple of rules that you're going to want to consider as you go through. The commission and the incentive is provided to a FAP, advisor, or connected person. That one's going to be pretty simple. A lot of them are going to come to life. The commission or incentive is provided as a result of the advisor giving the advice or the client acting on advice. So that's going to be something important for you to consider. And is that direct or indirect? And then a reasonable client would expect the commission or incentive to materially influence the way advice is given. I think what you'll find is some of these are very simple. And some businesses have very simple structures. Others, you can spend quite a long period of time debating these. So we would say if it's simple, have confidence, move forward, use a guide. It's going to meet your purposes. If you do have questions about whether or not they meet the threshold, be conservative. The likelihood of you over-disclosing and that being an issue with a client is minimal. The likelihood of you under-disclosing and that being an issue is much more significant. So what we'll talk about now, we'll give a quick overview of publicly available information. So that's going to be your FAP or authorized body licensing information, the nature and scope of the advice, and this is generally going to be on your website, so it doesn't have to be overly specific. You're just going to cover it in generalities. Fees or expenses, conflicts of interest, complaints handling dispute resolution, types of products and advice provided, duties of information, and contact details. Most of you will have this on your website, some of this on your website already. You don't necessarily have to call it disclosure on your website, and it can sit in different areas on your website. We will do the first webinar will be cementing the nature and scope of the advice that you're going to provide clients. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. So when the nature and scope of advice is known, and this is where you're starting to get into as you have more digital advice processes, the old 6-step process is not followed as simply as it used to be. So that's something you're going to have to consider as you go through the process. So the nature and scope of the advice, the reliability history, identifying information, fees or expenses, conflicts of interest and incentives, and availability of information. The third piece is when giving advice. So this is when you would expect everything to get much more detailed. And you're going to have very detailed information on the fees and expenses, any conflicts of interest and expenses that hasn't been dealt with previously, the complaints handling information, duties information, identifying information, and availability of information. So these are going to be important parts that a lot of you are going to choose to incorporate into your documents that's going to provide a lot of value in that space. And you're also going to be able to add to that, use common language, and integrate that into the advice process. And number 4, when a complaint is received, you're going to have certain requirements at that stage. Like I said, hopefully you don't get a lot, but this is something you're really going to have to pay attention to. You're going to need to incorporate that into your complaints process. And like I said, it's about your business. It's not about just individually segregating these out. So what we'll do is we'll start to talk about the workshop number 1. First, I just wanted to ask, Mark touched on it when we started, could you all please go to your, pick up your phone, your computer, and pull up the FSC guide? And I was just going to talk through and make a couple of comments on the FSC guide. In the FSC guide, you're going to have different scenarios, one being an authorized body, the other one being a financial advisor and a FAP. It's a great resource for you to go through, see who you and the advisors in your business identify with, and use that to create your disclosure. Very valuable for you to do that. What we're going to ask you to do now, we're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes, and we're going to ask you to consider how you would, all of the for your publicly available information when you've solidified the nature and scope of your advice. So when you're thinking about that, do you have any limitations to the type of advice you provide is very key to that. And also, what products and product lines are you advising on? I'd really like you, as you're going through, use this as an exercise to think about the future of your business. Are you planning on adding different business lines to your business in the near future? Are you considering growing your business? Or a lot of you will have a KiwiSaver platform. Are you planning on growing that or maturing that? So why don't we start now? We'll take about 7 or 8 minutes. You guys can go through that. We'll be walking around. If you have any questions, raise your hand. We'll be there to answer it. And then we'll come back and have a quick recap. Sweet. Okay, everybody. Can we wrap up that session? And we will move on to the second session. I did want to point out, as you can see, as you go through the process, a number of you have had questions. It's not always as easy as you think, and that's why the date on the 15th is really, really important. You should really be, I think David, Karty, and myself would say, in all of our areas, you should really be focusing on this area. But it's really important that as you move into the new regime, you're properly considering these things and ready, I think ideally well before the 15th. But keep in mind that in terms of your workflow, to make sure you're ready for the 15th. The second workshop is how to address conflicts of interest, incentives, and fees as you go through. So this is going to be into the scope of service page. If you want to go to the disclosure guide, which I think a number of you have up, that's on page 17. And on whatever you're recording something on, just give a brief description of any of the conflicts that you guys might have. And you can consider with that dealer groups. You can consider with that fees, soft dollar arrangements, those types of things, and how you're going to disclose those. In your scope of service type document at that stage. So let's start. Let's go for probably about 6 or 7 minutes. If anybody's got any questions, throw up their hand and enjoy. Oh, fantastic. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much. There's a lot of really interesting conversations going on. And really important conversations are being had. So with that, and it's obvious that there are a lot of questions, I did want to remind you that if you have questions, there's a lot of resources available for you to seek for help, and you really should do it. This is something in your business that you're really going to want to and have to get right. It's a very important part of the new regime, and it is a hard start on the 15th, so make sure you're prepared for that. It's going to be very important that you guys are ready. So from that, we'll hand back to Mark, and then we'll welcome Karty to the stage.
Quick thanks to Steve.
Hey, Mark.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Steve. It's great that we've got some of our top compliance people in the country helping us with this session today to give you the expertise. And what I really wanted to get for you today for that second session is some comfort and that how you can pick up that disclosure guide from the FSC, work through it and change the words in it. Who is comfortable now that they can get their disclosure pretty much sorted using the FSC guide? Who's thinking, oh no, I'm not really sure? Who's not sure whether they know or not? Because some hands didn't go up. It's a Boolean question, guys. It's either yes or no. Okay, so if you are still having trouble with disclosure, please grab one of us before you go, whether it be one of the legal team, one of the compliance experts, so that I want you to leave this room knowing how you can set up your disclosure and get it done over the next 22 working days and be ready to go live on the 15th of March. That's the objective of that second part of the session. So those first 2 parts of the session were very much about advisors. Okay, so as we know, disclosure has to be done by the 15th of March this year. The first thing we did about competence, we know we've kind of got for existing financial advisors, there's the 2-year transition period, with that little hook that your business has to be compliant by the 15th of March this year. The third part of this is now going into the full licensing requirements. So this is something that you have to have in place ticking over, looking awesome by the time you apply as a business for your full license. Now, I mentioned before that lovely FSC guide for full licensing requirements. If you haven't had a chance to read that yet, I do encourage you to have a read through. When you do read through it, don't panic. It is, any FMA people still in the room? It is an awful document. But we do need to get our heads around it, and there are people in this industry here to help. And the FMA, actually, to their credit, if you ring the helpline, they can be pretty helpful with this sort of stuff too. Or I'll give you an email address. Write this down: licensing@fma.org.nz. Got any questions about licensing? Email it to licensing@fma.org. fma.govt.nz. Make up an email address. That'll be terrible, won't it? Thanks, Karty. So licensing@fma.govt.nz. I'm assuming thinking FSC. Okay. So our third session's on business continuity planning. A very, very important part for any thing for every business. When we first went into lockdown in March last year, who ticked over their business on day one? No problem, just carry on working. Who had some little hurdles to deal with? Okay, think back to Christ. Well, actually, no, I don't want to steal Karty's thunder. So these things are what business continuity planning is about. If the unexpected happens, how does your business continue running? It is my absolute pleasure to welcome my friend, another one of these fantastic experts, Karty Maine from Rosewill Consulting, who's going to be ably supported by Jeremy Muir of MinterEllisonRuddWatts. So thank you both. Can I hand over to you? Can I have a big clap for these guys, please?
Hello. I scored a little bit the easy job for the lawyers this afternoon in terms of introducing this topic and Karty. Karty is going to do an admirable job of telling you all about business continuity plans. He has some excellent slides, stories, and you will leave better educated than you started on that topic. In relation to the legal aspects underpinning this, I could point out that there is no requirement in the Financial Markets Conduct Act which says you need to have a business continuity plan. So you can all go home. Yes, that's not quite the whole answer though. There is a requirement for you to have a license, and the legislation does empower the Financial Markets Authority to put conditions on licenses. So the way that this one comes in is that when you get a full license, it will be subject to 7, I think, standard conditions. This is more than the 2 standard conditions that apply to the transitional licenses. And one of those standard conditions is business continuity and technology systems. So I will just, in case you haven't worked your way through that yet, and because it is relatively brief, I will just read you the condition because it will set the scene for what Karty will go on to say. Condition: you must have and maintain a business continuity plan. So this is the licensed FAP, the business, that is appropriate for the scale and scope of your financial advice service. If you use any technology systems which, if disrupted, would materially affect the continued provision of your financial advice service or any other market services licensee obligation, you must at all times ensure that information security for those systems, being the preservation of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and/or information systems, is maintained. And then you must notify us, being the Financial Markets Authority, within 10 working days of you discovering any event that materially impacts the information security of your critical technology systems, which is defined below in the condition, and provide details of the event, the impact on your financial advice service and clients, as well as your remediation activity. So it's the putting right that counts how you're going to fix it. There is in that condition also an explanatory note which talks about the need to have documented procedures that guide you to respond, recover, resume and restore a predefined level of operation. Your plan should consider the loss of availability of your key resources, including staff, record systems, suppliers and premises. It notes that larger or more complex businesses will need to consider a wider range of disruptive events and reflect this in a more comprehensive business continuity plan. It's important that your plan is maintained, reviewed and regularly tested. So that's basically what the condition says. You can also get more detail by looking in the FMA's wonderful application guide, as has been introduced by Mark. And that also sets out the questions that they will specifically ask you in relation to your business continuity plan. So when you are applying for your full license, that you should be putting yourself in a position to actually answer those questions. And if I give you one example out of that, the way that guide works is it talks about, it has two columns, one of which is what we ask and then what we mean, as if those things might be mutually exclusive. But in particular in the what we ask section for business continuity, does the FAP have fully documented and approved business continuity arrangements? If yes, it has some follow-up questions. Did the arrangements include the protection of client information, etc., etc.? If no, please explain how the FAP intends to meet the business continuity and technology systems license condition. Here's a trap for young players, I think. Don't answer no. I think that's the answer where the trapdoor opens underneath you and you get you fall through into the pool full of sharks. So the easier approach will be to answer yes and then explain what you do. So on that note, I will hand over to Karty.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, from my experience with licensing, you don't want to answer a question in a way that just opens up the ground before you. Business continuity, it's a bit of a passion for me. Back in 2010, when I was a newly appointed risk and compliance manager for Guardian Trust, the business was owned by Suncorp at that stage, and Suncorp were really passionate about business continuity. And for everyone else, it wasn't really an in thing at that stage. But every 2 weeks, I had to go and get together a whole lot of information and do a Zoom call with my Australian colleagues, and they would train us on business continuity every 2 weeks. And I thought, gosh, pretty overkill on this one area. And then on the 4th of September 2010, the first major earthquake hit in Christchurch. And all of a sudden, I was the business continuity coordinator for New Zealand, and it was on my shoulders to suddenly implement this plan and look after a whole team of people which were down in Christchurch, and we didn't know what was happening. There was a lack of information, and the first thing, of course, is the mobile network went down. So for me, what I learned out of that experience is that, yes, there's a whole lot of theory and technical information that sits behind your business continuity plan and what you're going to need to put together to get your full license, but in reality, it's about people. People are our number one responsibility. You know, business continuity plans save lives. We can replace technology, we can replace buildings, we can replace client files if we had to. A lot were lost in Christchurch earthquake, but we cannot replace people. So I can't stress enough that business continuity is important because there's so much there linked to saving lives. So I've got a bit of a simple agenda. We've got some slides here which will be part of a slide pack that will be sent out to you. So I'm not going to dwell on the slides. More think about the slides as reference material that you can go back to in your own time. And we're going to take this as a bit of a game of two halves. We're going to do a little bit of a theory about business continuity plans, what's important about them and what to put in them. But really, the strong hint that I've been given by the organisers is let's make this practical. Let's get you into this as much as possible. So let's see if we can do this out of the session. So just thinking back again to the Christchurch earthquake, one of the things that we had to do in that first September earthquake is we had to get engineer report to go through the building and make sure that it was safe. And because there was a shortage of engineers in Christchurch at that time, it actually took quite a long time before Guardian Trust staff were allowed back in the building. And after the first week, they started to get really cross and grumpy at me because we hadn't given them the clearance to go back in the building, but we hadn't had that report or that clearance. And most of the rest of the Christchurch had actually gone back to work by then, no matter what condition their building was in. So we finally got this report. It had some cracks, we got it fixed, and I think our people were at home about 3 times longer than any other business in Christchurch. Then when the major earthquake hit in February the following year, and we had the terrible situation of the PGC building fall down. Now, I don't know if you know much about the trustee industry, but like any industry, it's a very close industry. And when you work for one trustee company, you've often worked for the others. So you know each other very well, or there's a lot of family relationships that happen as a result of that. So it was like our own family had suffered that. So we lost a lot of lives in that Christchurch earthquake when PGC building went down, but I had so many fabulous calls from our staff in Christchurch because they said, thank you so much for not letting us back in the building back in September, because when the next earthquake hit, we had confidence that our building wasn't going to fall down and that we were going to be safe because you'd taken that extra time. So to me, this is what business continuity is all about. So what is a BCP? So essentially there's 3 elements to it. The first part is the emergency response plan. What do you do in emergency and what action do you take there and then? Quite often you immediately become under the supervision of civil defence or wardens of your building. All sorts of people, the fire department and so on will take over and guide you. So understanding your responsibilities in that emergency situation is really important. Once you've got through those first few days under the emergency cordon, you've got to start thinking about your business and your customers and how you actually get back to work and life goes on. And there's sort of like a level of tolerance that the rest of the country has when one particular area is suffering some sort of disaster or major event. So you've only got a limited timeline to get up and running again before your clients will start to walk away. And the third thing is your IT or your disaster recovery. So that's how you make sure that you can get your technology up and running again, you can use your systems to recover the backups and so on. Quite often, in an emergency situation, it's not the IT expert that gets left holding the can. They might be out of action, they may have been killed, they may be in hospital, all sorts of things could have happened to them. So the key thing for things like a disaster recovery plan is could a lay person implement it and recover the IT. And that's why I like to use a lot of photos and screenshots and so on with really good diagrams and explanations to show people how to recover systems in the event that the IT provider isn't available. So we're going to just cover over some of the risks. I'll let you read that at your leisure and what your BCP should contain. And this is all to help you get across the line by the time you apply for your full licence. But the first thing is the emergency response. So on your tables, you should have on, towards the back, the first example. And this is exercise 1 under the BCP. So if you'd just like to go to workshop part 3, page 12, and we've got a wee scenario here for your table to work through. Because remember, we're trying to be as real and practical about this as possible. So let's imagine that you're me back in 2020. Or say that you're visiting a client and you're in a high-rise building, say the Vero building in Auckland, and suddenly there's a major earthquake and it hits somewhere else around the country, the civil defence siren goes off. So just work your way through now in your tables. First of all, what are the immediate actions that you will take? Secondly, what client care strategies will you initiate? So how will you look after your clients? Might be clients in the building, in offices, for example, stuck in toilets, maybe. And then what checks will you make on your business premises before you let your staff go back to work from there? So we'll just give you a couple of minutes on that, and then we're going to look into the second part, business continuity. To be a few tables without a workbook. My apologies. If anyone's got a spare workbook or there's a table next to you with a spare workbook, can you just let me know and I'll pass it on to the tables who haven't got one? Okay, did you survive your emergency? Did you manage to get out of your building? Follow your building warden's instructions? Did you have a plan where you know that you've got all your staff together? And did you group down in your emergency assembly point? So these are some of the things that you should have off pat for your emergency response plan, knowing how to get your people, any clients, any other people who are in your building safely out of harm's way. Clearing toilets, stairs, lifts, anywhere else where people might get stuck. Okay, so that's our initial emergency. We've then got business continuity. So this is normally kicks in a few days after the emergency event. So this is when life is starting to resume, okay? People want to do business with you, they've given you enough time to get your house in order, they want to know that you're organised, their client files are looked after. If they invest with you, they might want access to their money. They need communication with you. So this is really where business continuity kicks in. So it's about having a process where you know those critical functions. Some functions you don't need at the business continuity side, okay? You don't need your client file checks if there's an emergency, that can wait. Whereas there's other things like updating websites, making sure the IT is working, making salary payments to staff, all those things are really important to carry on because people rely on them. So identifying critical business functions is a really important step in the business continuity. Also having backup strategies, is there an alternative location? Lots of us are now using our homes, which are great, but is our home actually set up and safe for having personal client information there? And have we got suitable technology for working at home for any length of time? So we need to start doing a bit of a risk assessment on our business in terms of what type of events are likely, possible but likely in our type of business, and have we got a response to those things? And the key thing is, can we get hold of people quickly? So if you were to take your mobile phone now, could you send one text and reach everyone in your business that's really important to reach? Okay, some of you yes, some of you no. Okay, the same thing. Is there an alternative person assigned to do your job if you're not available as a result of that event? So having quick contact lists, backup people, all really important. So we're going to move on to the second scenario. This is page 13 of your book, and I'm going to read it out for the people who haven't got a book. And I apologise that it's a bit of a painful one. We did start with something a bit milder, but my colleagues assured me that you would just work from your hospital bed. So that wasn't going to be good enough. We needed something serious enough that you couldn't actually do that. So let's imagine that you're a sole trader. While on holiday, you've contracted COVID-19, the bad one. You're currently in hospital and they're about to put you in a respirator and they're going to put you out of action for 2 weeks. And probably in an induced coma. So you've got 15 minutes to put your BCP, your business continuity plan, in action, so not long, before they plan to put you under. So you need to activate your Locum advisor, all right? So this is the person who's your backup. So what immediate actions would you take to activate that Locum advisor? Like how would you get hold of them? What would you instruct them? What delegations of authority will you give them? Like, will you let them access your bank account, make payments on your behalf? All those type of things. What client care strategies would you initiate? Okay, you know, how do you look after your client base when you've got somebody else looking after them? Again, are there any limitations you're going to put on that Locum advisor? And are there any other business continuity strategies that you need to put in place while that locum advisor is looking after your business. Because ideally you want a business to come back to, okay? You don't want them to put you out of business. So think about the locum advisor. Do a great job because they're fully briefed and they know exactly what you want them to do, and they know the delegations of authority, what they can and can't do with your business. Yeah? Anyone feeling not quite prepared on that? So these are some of the things that the FMA is asking for you to think about and have strategies for, depending on the size, scale of your business. So all these things will need to be thought through and mapped out before you apply for your full license. Okay, so the third area is the disaster recovery. So this is really focusing on recovering your IT systems. So you've got to make sure that you can protect the client information, that you can access it, and if things need to be, backups need to become your prime system again, do you know how to do that? Do you know how to go in and what to touch and what not to touch so that you don't end up losing your whole system, which is something like I'd probably do. So again, we've got some ideas and some hints on here for you. But one of the big things that the FMA is concerned with when you read the full licensing guide is this whole issue of cybersecurity. You know, since COVID-19 has hit, pretty much, you know, every teenager who's at home with nothing to do and a laptop is working out ways on how to access your system and how to cause you problems. So I spend a lot of time looking at some of the government websites on cybersecurity because it's not an area that I'm an expert in. And they tell me at the moment malware is being spread via an email link. So here's your scenario 3 for disaster recovery on page, should be on about page 14, I'd expect. So, and this is totally out of the government website, so it really is happening. So a malware can, so you have to imagine this is happening now in your business, if it hasn't already, hopefully not. A malware campaign is being spread through attachments or links in emails is currently affecting New Zealanders. Your admin person has opened a link in the email and the malware has gained access to their email account and can send emails out to their contact list to keep spreading the malware. Once a computer has been infected with this malware, it can result in significant financial loss or data loss through ransomware infections. So your challenge, or mission impossible, is what immediate actions do you take? What instructions do you give to your staff? And how do you recover your uninfected client information from your backup system? Okay, shall we wrap that exercise up? How comfortable do you feel if there was a malware attack on your business? It's a scary thought, right? But it's happening to businesses that, you know, we go see around New Zealand, so it's happening at the moment. So obviously the first thing that you want to do is, you know, get IT help really quickly. So if you haven't reviewed the CERT New Zealand, C-E-R-T, New Zealand website, it has exactly all the answers for what to do in a malware situation, the steps to take, and time is of the essence with this type of attack. You do not muck around, like every minute counts in terms of their access to your systems and datas. Okay, so the final part I'm just going to talk about is let's get practical. So how do we actually do this thing and put it all together and make sure that we can satisfy the FMA with the full license? So the first thing is write your BCP. Okay, start with a good template if you can find one or you can purchase one. Download one from the internet if you have to. They're available all over the place. They're pretty common now, sample BCP websites and templates. But the key thing is the thinking behind it. So you want to do a risk assessment on your business and say, what are the key type of threats that would bring our business to its knees? Now, we used to talk about you know, possible but unlikely. In this day and age, when we talk about risk, we talk about when, not if. Because the 1 in 100-year events, the 1 in 30-year events seem to be happening with a lot more frequency and a lot bigger velocity. So they come faster, harder, quicker, more frequently. So we have to be prepared for these different events. And it's really important to keep your BCP up to date. They age really quickly because people leave the business, their addresses and cell phone and email addresses change. So you really need one person responsible who's got a job of regularly keeping it up to date. There's quite a bit of work in that because often there's a sort of a privacy issue. People don't want to give out their home address or their private cell phone numbers. And so you have to get around that and say it's only for the business continuity purpose. So that's why we need that information. And then you have to promise to safeguard it and not use it for other reasons. So that's important. You need to test your BCP. You need to know that it's actually going to work. So if you're in a multi-storey building, for example, take everyone downstairs for coffee and then suddenly run a BCP test. Say, right, I'm not here, I'm dead. Such and such, you're my backup person. All of a sudden, I need you to run this BCP event and have a wee mock scenario. It's quite fun. You can sort of create all sorts of interesting scenarios. But also, if there's a live event, like the COVID-19 thing, take that as a real live test, because it tested you in real time in terms of how you responded, what you had in place, what you didn't. So all you need to do is write up some notes about what did we learn from last year in terms of how efficient we were in implementing a business continuity plan. And that in itself is enough to prove that you've done a test. Okay, but you want to do tests on a relatively frequent basis. And then the next thing is keeping it current. Okay, so you need to review it regularly. You need to make sure that you think about the 3 different components of it: the emergency response, business continuity, as well as the disaster recovery. You need to think about what different threats are in the environment now, any exercises or any tests that didn't go so well that indicate that you need to change some of your processes. Maybe people didn't respond quickly enough, or it just didn't happen the way that you imagined it would. All this is a signal to test and train and regroup on your BCP and bring it up to date. Any changes to your business structure or the key people in your business, you need to go back over that training again and not assume that new people will be across all your processes and requirements in an emergency. And the more geographically spread you are, locations around the different part of the country, the more that you will need individual BCPs for all those locations. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't need to have a really big, thick book. It might just be you have a 1-page contact sheet for who all the key people are in that location and how to contact them. But the other thing that I like to have on hand is who are all the suppliers that I need in emergency. People like your plumber and your electrician and your landlord and your insurance company are sort of probably my top 4. Because if things go wrong and the mobile phone network is down or you haven't got information ready to hand, you might need them to come in an emergency and deal with the problem for you. So the more that you can have that information to hand, the better that you're prepared that you'll be. And I guess my final lesson really is that from my experience, even really good leaders in a major event tend to panic. You know, adrenaline kicks in. The most calm of leaders, if they're not trained in how to deal with the BCP event, they can still struggle and panic and what do we do, and they go all over the place. So when you choose your business continuity person, train them well, but also find somebody who's got a pretty level temperament that can cope with people, you know, who are normally quite calm and normally quite rational, but will listen to them and take their instructions in emergency. So your business continuity plan, like any other document, it will have a life cycle. Keep it, nurture it, grow it, keep it up to date, make it real for your business, keep the training going. create simple, separate scenarios to run simple tests so that you can iron out the kinks and make sure that it will work. And stress again, just keep it up to date. So that's it for me on business continuity. So the detail on there is on these slides that'll be emailed out to you. The devil in the detail is in that FMA licensing guide, some other components. So even if you've got a BCP already, I would guarantee that the licensing guide will raise the bar. There'll be some extra components that you'll have to put into it. So just watch out for that. All right, thanks guys. Mark, I'll leave to you.
Thank you very much, Karty. So over the last 3 sessions, we've cherry-picked. We've taken a couple of elements of what is going to be part of this new regime and given you a little bit more detail or dug a little bit deeper into 3 areas. We've got some elements that are going to become law in 22 working days, a lot of them actually, and then there's a few that will happen through the full licensing, and then we're fully implemented on the 15th of March 2023. At the start of the session, I asked you, on a scale of 0, oh my God, to 10, yeah, we're sorted, how are you feeling about the 15th of March 2021? After the last 3 little mini sessions, who's just as confident or more confident than they were at the start of the session? Good. Is there anybody feeling a little bit less confident that you've found out some things that you weren't really sure about and thought, jeepers, I wasn't aware of that? Okay, how about for the 15th of March 2023 or for full licensing? Who's still feeling very confident for full licensing? Okay, who's still thinking, oh, I've got a little bit to do to get ready for a full license? Okay, so the industry is here to help you. Now, before I give my final wrap up, I want to introduce Penny Sheerin. Penny is another one of our amazing legal people that has been instrumental to not only the disclosure guide, but a number of the things that we've been doing in the FSC. She's from Chapman Tripp, and I've asked Penny if she'd give us a little bit of an overview of, in particular, what you need to have ready for the 15th of March 2021, and then a little bit of an intro to what happens a little bit later. So please welcome Penny Sheerin.
Thanks, Mark, and hi, everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed the various sessions today and that you're all largely feeling on top of how you're going to be complying with your new obligations under FSLA. As Mark said, I've been asked to give you a brief overview again of the FSLA regime and really just as a final refresher for you for the day of the key dates and the obligations that you'll have. So as you'll all know, and I just heard Mark say, it's 15 March 2021, that's 32 days away, or as Mark just said, 22 working days. By then, every financial advice provider will need to have a transitional licence in place. If you're not going to be obtaining a licence yourself, you need to be providing advice only under someone else's licence, as a financial advisor or a nominated representative. Your transitional licence applications should really all be in with the FMA by now, but if they're not, please get on with it promptly, and you can do this relatively easily online. And you'll also need to start getting ready to comply with a range of broader duties and obligations that you'll have from the 15th of March. So assuming that you're advising retail clients, these duties include taking reasonable steps to ensure that your clients understand the nature and scope of the advice that you're providing, including any limitations on that advice. So, for example, you must explain if you're only able to give advice about certain types of financial products. Where there's a conflict of interest, you must give priority to your client's interests. At all times, you must be exercising care, diligence, and skill in your work. And you need to comply with the requirements of the new Code of Professional Conduct for Financial Advice Services, and in particular, from 15 March, those requirements relating to ethical behaviour, conduct, and client care. So those are requirements to treat your clients fairly, to act with integrity, to give financial advice that's suitable, to ensure that your client understands the advice, and to protect client information. As I'm sure you're all aware as well, there are competency requirements under this code. However, there is a 2-year transition period for you to meet those requirements. So in terms of some of your other duties that you'll have from the 15th of March in a few days, you must only recommend financial products to clients that are offered in compliance with the Financial Markets Conduct Act and its regulations. And you must also ensure that you follow the new disclosure regulations, making various prescribed bits of information available at different points in the financial advice process. Any information you make available, you must ensure that it is not false or misleading or incomplete. You must also make sure that anyone you engage as a financial service provider to give advice under your licence complies with all of these duties that I've just described. You need to have appropriate processes and controls in place if you're engaging nominated representatives. And these processes and controls should allow you to control the advice that's been given and the circumstances in which it's been given by those nominated representatives. If you do engage nominated representatives, you'll also need to ensure that you don't give or you don't offer to give any inappropriate incentives. You have to tell the FMA of various things if you materially contravene your obligations. You must also let them know if you change your legal structure of your business or if you make certain other changes, such as making changes to the directors or to other senior people in the organisation. And finally, you need to be complying with any licence conditions that the FMA may include when granting your licence, including the standard conditions and the licence conditions which are imposed in the law. There are 2 standard transitional licence conditions which relate to record keeping and having an internal dispute resolution process. So, that's everything that you need to have in place by the 15th of March. What happens after that? Well, immediately after that, you have 3 months to update your financial service provider or FSPR registration to link in any individual financial advisors that you engage under your licence. And then you've got 2 years, up to 15 March 2023, to go through the process of obtaining your full licence and ensuring that you can meet those competency requirements under the code. And as part of obtaining your full licence, you'll need to get ready to comply with the full licence conditions which the FMA has set out for licence holders and for those people that are authorised under a licence. You've obviously learned a little bit about one of those just now with Karty and others earlier, but those conditions are record keeping, having an internal complaints process, both like your transitional licence, also additional ones for regulatory returns, outsourcing, business continuity and technology systems, ongoing eligibility, and notification of material changes. So as is always the case with regulatory change, there's lots to do, and I think this is going to bring a great progression for the industry. Hopefully you've all got a lot out of today, learnt a lot, and also met a range of the people who are available, and a few I can see around the room, who I know are available to help you if you need some extra help. Good luck, everyone. I'll hand back to Mark now for a few final words to wrap up the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago that I picked up the phone and called colleagues and all the insurers around the country. And I know Trevor's here today, and I can't remember, don't know whether there's anybody else that was in those initial phone calls. We got together and we thought, what can we do to help financial advisors get ready for this regime that is coming? And that group of people morphed into the Financial Services Council and became the Advisor Transition Working Group, which led on to the regular messages that we got out to you and to events like this one. Thanks to Richard Clippett and the FSC for kind of absorbing us. It took a little bit of convincing for Richard to get him to accept the role of taking on a little bit of advisor education, because the Financial Services Council generally, of course, is the industry organisation for insurers and KiwiSaver providers and those sorts of entities. And so encouraging him that we could get involved and help financial advisors was a big step. So a big thanks to Richard for saying yes to that. And so I hope that over the course of this journey, one of the things that we aim to do was to get consistent messaging. So although you may receive the same message from 4 or 5 different providers, if you're dealing with 4 or 5 different providers, you'll notice that message is identical. Because the alternative, if we hadn't have gotten together 3 or 4 years ago, then you would have received slightly different messages at slightly different times on slightly different subjects, and it would have been completely overwhelming. So hopefully that consistency of messaging has come across and made your life just that little bit easier. Hopefully things like the disclosure guide have made things a little bit easier, and we will continue to be involved to help you to make sense of this one, because it's not easy. And while you have 2 years from the 15th of March for your financial advice provider to jump through these hoops and to prove to the FMA that you've done it, I would encourage you not to jump too early, Give time for the dust to settle, to understand all those requirements, but also don't leave it to the last 4 or 5 months, because in that time, everyone else is going to be applying, and the FMA will at some point, as they did last year around December, say, here's your deadline. If you're not in by this date, we can't guarantee you'll have it in time for the 15th of March 2023. So there'll be a window of about 12 months there where you want to be ready, and we're going to be with you on that journey to try and make it as easy for you as we can. I'd like to again say a really huge thank you to the team that have been involved in this workshop today. So firstly, our compliance experts, David Greenslade of Strategi, Steve Burgess of Compliance Refinery, and Karty Maine of Rosewill Consulting, and also to our legal experts. And we have some of that team are here today. Nick Summerfield from Anthony Harper, Penny Sheerin, one of the partners from Chapman Tripp, Tracey Cross, wherever Tracey's gone, from DLA Piper, and Jeremy Muir from MinterEllisonRuddWatts. I also really want to thank the lawyers that couldn't make it today, David Ireland from Denton's Kensington Swan, Tim Williams from Chapman Tripp, and Katie Dow from Bell Gully, because it was that team that together produced that disclosure guide for you. I hope that makes your journey to prepare your disclosure a lot easier. And we are here to help you. So come and corner us, have a conversation, get our contact details, and we'll be available. Some of the guys charge a fee. I'm an employee of Partners Life, but I don't know as much as they do. So sometimes guys, you've got to reach into your pockets and get some advice. We are in the industry of telling people to get advice. We are in the industry of telling people to prepare for risk. So a business continuity plan, that's our risk. That's us managing our risk. Seeing these legal experts, seeing these compliance advisors is us getting advice when we need it. Thank you very much for being a part of today. I do hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks, everybody.